had not allowed themselves a long rest and came back quite soon. Greet had put her arm around her mother and was nearly carrying her. "What shall we take now, then?" said Greet, and looked around. Her eyes met those of Gregor on the wall. Perhaps only because her mother was there, she remained calm, bent her face so that she would not look around, and said, albeit hurriedly and with a tremor in her voice, "Come on, let's go back to the living room for a while." Gregor could see what Greet had in mind. She wanted to take her mother somewhere safe and then chase him down from the wall. Well, she could certainly try it. He sat unyielding on his picture. He'd rather jumped at Greet's face. But Greet's words had made her mother quite worried. She stepped to one side, saw the enormous brown patch against the flowers of the wallpaper, and before she even realized it was Gregor that she saw, screamed, "Oh God! Oh God!" Arms outstretched, she fell onto the couch as if she had given up everything and stayed there immobile. "Gregor!" shouted his sister, glowering at him and shaking her fist. That was the first word she had spoken to him directly since his transformation. She ran into the other room to fetch some kind of smelling salts and bring her mother out from her faint. Gregor wanted to help too. He could save his picture later, although he stuck fast to the glass and had to pull himself off by force. Then he, too, ran into the next room as if he could advise his sister like in the old days, but had to just stand behind her and do nothing. She was looking into various bottles. He startled her when she turned around. A bottle fell to the ground and broke. A splinter cut Gregor's face. Some kind of caustic medicine splashed all over him. Now, without delaying any longer, Greet took hold of all the bottles she could and ran them into her mother. She slammed the door shut with her foot. So now Gregor was shut out from his mother, who, because of him, might be near to death. He could not open the door if he did not want to chase his sister away, and she had to stay with his mother. There was nothing for him to do but wait, and, oppressed with anxiety and self-reproach, he began to crawl about. He crawled over everything, walls, furniture, ceiling, and finally, in his confusion, as the whole room began to spin around him, he fell down into the middle of the dinner table. He lay there for a while, numb and immobile. All around him it was quiet. Maybe that was a good sign. Then there was someone at the door. The maid, of course, had locked herself in the kitchen so that Greet would have to go in and answer it. His father had arrived home. "What happened?" were his first words. Greet's appearance must have made everything clear to him. She answered him with subdued voice and openly pressed her face to his chest. "Mother's fainted, but she's better now. Gregor got out." "Just as I expected," said his father. "Just as I always said, but you women wouldn't listen, would you?" It was clear to Gregor that Greet had not said enough, and that his father had took it to mean that something bad had happened, that he was responsible for some act of violence. That meant Gregor would now have to try to calm his father, as he did not have time to explain things to him, even if that had been possible. So he fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it so that his father, when he came back in from the hall, could see straight away that Gregor had the best intentions and would go back into his room without delay. That it would not be necessary to drive him back, but that they only had to open the door and he would disappear. His father, though, was not in the mood to notice subtleties like that. "Ah!" he shouted as he came in, sounding as if he were both angry and glad at the same time. Gregor drew his head back from the door and lifted it towards his father. He really had not imagined his father the way he stood there now, of late, with his new habit of crawling about. He had neglected to pay attention to what was going on in the rest of the flat the way he had done before. He really ought to have expected things to have changed, but still, was that really his father? The same tired man who used to be laying there entombed in his bed when Gregor came back from his business trips, who would receive him sitting in the armchair in his nightgown when he came back in the evenings, who was even hardly able to stand up, but as a sign of his pleasure would just raise his arms, and who, a couple times a year when they went for a walk together on Sunday or public holiday, wrapped up tightly in his overcoat between Gregor and his mother, would always labor in the way forward a little slowly, more slowly than them, who were already walking slowly for his sake, who would place his stick down carefully and, if he wanted to say something, would invariably stop and gather his companions around him. He was standing up straight enough now, dressed in a smart blue uniform with gold buttons, the sort worn by the employees at the banking institute. Above the high, stiff collar of his coat, and a strong double chin emerged. Under the bushy eyebrows, his piercing dark eyes looked out fresh and alert. His normally unkempt white hair was combed down painfully close to his scalp. He took his cap, with its gold monogram from probably some bank, and threw it in an arc right across the room onto the sofa, put his hands in his trouser pockets, pushing back the bottom of his long uniform coat, and, with the look of determination, walked towards Gregor. He probably did not even know himself what he had in mind, but nonetheless lifted his feet unusually high. Gregor was amazed at the enormous size of the soles of his boots, but wasted no time with that. He knew full well, right from the first day of his new life, that his father thought it necessary to always be extremely strict with him. And so he ran to his father, stopped when his father stopped, scurried forwards again when he moved, even slightly. In this way they went round and round the room several times without anything decisive happening, without even giving the impression of a chase, as everything went so slowly. Gregor remained all this time on the floor, largely because he feared his father might see it as especially provoking if he fled into the wall or the ceiling. Whatever he did, Gregor had to admit that it certainly would have not been able to keep up this running for about so long, as for each step his father took he had to carry out countless movements. He became noticeably short of breath. Even in his early life, his lungs had not been very reliable. Now, as he lurched about in his efforts to muster all the strength he could for running, he could hardly keep his eyes open. His thoughts became too slow for him to think of any other way of saving himself than running. He almost forgot that the walls were there for him to use, although here they were concealed behind carefully carved furniture full of notches and protrusions. Then, right beside him, lightly tossed, something flew down and rolled in front of him. It was an apple. Then another one immediately flew at him. Gregor froze in shock. There was no longer any point in running, as his father had decided to bombard him. He had filled his pockets with fruit from the bowl on the sideboard, and now, without even taking the time for careful aim, threw one apple after another. These little red apples rolled out onto the floor, knocking into each other as if they had electric motors. An apple thrown without much force glanced against Gregor's back and slid off without doing any harm. Another one, however, immediately following it, hit squarely and lodged in his back. Gregor wanted to drag himself away, as if he could remove the surprising, the incredible pain changing his position, but he felt as if nailed to the spot and spread himself out, all his senses in confusion. The last thing he saw was the door of his room being pulled open. His sister was screaming. His mother ran out in front of her in her blouse, as his sister had taken some of her clothes after she had fainted to make it easier for her to breathe. She ran to his father, her skirts unfastened and sliding on one after another to the ground. Stumbling over the skirts, she pushed herself to his father, her arms around him, uniting herself with him totally. Now Gregor lost his ability to see anything, her hands behind his father's head begging him to spare Gregor's life.